Well, if you want a clear example of how unstable the world has become right now, you only need to look at the headlines from today, because we are seeing military postseason in the Middle East to wheat oil prices become right now, you only know, pressure building in Europe, and world leaders preparing for what could become a much larger geopolitical crisis. Israel has confirmed a major military strike that reportedly killed a senior Iranian naval commander connected to operations around the Strait of Hormuz. And that single event has immediately triggered global concern, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is one of the most important oil transit choke points in the entire world, with roughly a fifth of global oil supply passing through that narrow stretch of water. So whenever tensions rise in that area, oil markets react, governments react, and ordinary people eventually feel it in the form of higher fuel prices, higher transport costs, higher food prices, and higher cost of living. And this is exactly why governments across Europe are already starting to react even before any major retaliation has happened. Poland, for example, has already announced plans to cut VAT and excise duties on fuel in order to protect drivers from rising prices caused by instability in the Middle East. And this tells you everything you need to know about how seriously governments are taking this situation. They are not waiting for the crisis to fully develop. They are preparing for the economic consequences in advance. And that is usually a sign that leaders believe this situation could last longer and potentiate further. Meanwhile, in the United States, there are reports that Donald Trump is preparing to hold cabinet-level discussions, where the situation with Iran, Israel, and oil routes will likely be a major topic, because any instability involving Iran and the Strait of Hormuz automatically becomes a major strategic concern for Washington. The United States has military assets in the region, alliances to protect, shipping routes to secure, and a global economic system that depends heavily on stable energy supply routes. And this is why what might look like a regional military strike is actually something with global implications. Because if Iran decides to retaliate in a way that threatens shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, even temporarily, oil prices could spike dramatically within days. Shipping insurance costs would rise, transport costs would rise, and those costs would eventually be passed on to consumers all around the world. And this is how a military incident in one part of the world ends up affecting grocery prices, fuel prices, and inflation in completely different countries. And this is why markets, governments, and military analysts are all watching this situation extremely closely right now, because the real danger is not just the initial strike, but what happens next. The Middle East has a long history of escalation cycles where one strike leads to retaliation. Retaliation leads to counter-retaliation. And before long, the situation becomes much larger than anyone originally intended. And the Strait of Hormuz is particularly dangerous in this context because it is such a narrow and strategically important route that even small incidents there can have massive global consequences. If ships cannot pass safely, oil supply slows down. If oil supply slows down, prices go up. When prices go up, inflation rises. When inflation rises, governments face political pressure. And suddenly a military confrontation turns into a global economic problem, and we are already seeing early signs of this economic pressure building. Fuel prices in parts of Europe have already risen significantly, and governments are worried that if the situation escalates further, they could face public anger over the cost of living once again. And remember, many countries are still dealing with inflation problems from the last few years. So another energy price shock is the last thing most governments want right now. But unfortunately, governments do not always control these situations once they begin escalating. Military decisions, retaliation strategies, alliances, and political pressure all start interacting in unpredictable ways. And that is why analysts are now asking the most important question of all: is this a contained escalation, or is this the beginning of a larger confrontation between Israel and Iran? Because if this conflict becomes more direct and more open, it could draw in other countries in the region, disrupt global shipping routes, and create a much wider geopolitical crisis. And history has shown us many times that conflicts involving energy supply routes and major regional powers rarely stay small for long. They tend to grow, they tend to pull other nations into the situation, and they tend to affect the global economy in ways that ordinary people only notice weeks or months later when prices start rising and governments start talking about economic pressure. So while this story might currently appear as just another international headline, the reality is that it could become one of the most important global stories of the year if the situation continues to escalate. Because this is not just about Israel and Iran. This is about oil supply, global trade routes, inflation, politics, and the balance of power in one of the most strategically important regions in the world. And right now, the world is waiting to see what happens next. Because the next move, whether it is retaliation or further military action, will determine whether this situation calms down or becomes something far more serious. And if history is any guide, moments like this often turn out to be the beginning of much bigger global events than people realize at the time.